Hi, Deb.
How are you?
Good,
You look good. I thought I saw Karen Levine a minute ago.
She definitely was in here not too long ago. There we go. And we got several people joining now.
Hi, Eileen.
So are we all not having our video on then?
Hi.
Oh, no, you absolutely can. You should be able to hear.
I'm not able to.
Okay.
There's a web site.
There we are, Sharon. You should be able to now. We'll let everybody file through and keep jumping on in. We'll wait just one more minute.
I'm not seeing. Okay.
Once again, we do apologize for the extra steps for video. That extra security, make sure we don't see anything we don't want to see.
I'm glad you're doing that. Earlier this week, I was on a Zoom call and child pornography dropped into the call.
No.
It's very upsetting. So I appreciate all your controls.
That's horrible.
It's horrible that it was happening to a child.
Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah.
how old was the child?
Maybe 2.
Yeah.
Oh,
Mm-hmm.
oh.
All right, I will get started. Jeremy, if you could help me shuffle people in and get them set up. In case, thank you all for coming. In case you haven't noticed, I am not Wendy Goldberg. I am Eric Servione. I'm the Deputy Director for Tri-Faith. Wendy right now is actually at an all-day online conference on this topic. So she's learning much, and she asked me to step in and help facilitate because we think this is a very good conversation for us to have. Today, we're going to be talking about combating bigotry in its many different forms. We'll focus in on one specific type of bigotry, but we can definitely branch out from there. We won't do any breakout rooms this session just because we are in a webinar format and it doesn't allow us to do that. But I think we're going to have a great discussion. I'm going to start off by sharing a photo with everybody. Here we go. Can everybody see this nice photo of these children smiling and hugging? And this is to get our collective juices flowing. You see, it says, nobody is born a racist. Now, there it is. Did everybody see it? Okay, I'm gonna launch a poll. A poll should be up on your Zoom now. And this is anonymous, completely anonymous. It's just asking you, do you agree with that? Here, I'll get that out of the way for you. Do you agree with that statement? And again, it's completely anonymous and don't even, your name won't show up anywhere on the answers and such.
What happened to it?
Relaunch polling. It got closed for some reason. Let me try it again. I just relaunched it. Go ahead and vote one more time. And I think since technically people are co-hosts, you might be able to accidentally close it. So no need to close it. Just click. It does look like we have a overwhelming yes. I don't see any no's. I don't see any depends. I'm going to stop sharing here.
Mine wouldn't click.
Uh-oh.
So put me down for a yes.
Got you down as a yes. Very nice.
Yeah,
All right, I've
mine
stopped
wouldn't click
sharing.
either.
So why do we think that is? Now let's have a quick discussion just to, again, get us going and such. Nobody is born a racist. I think, for me at least, it's a thing that society teaches. It's people that teach young children, like we saw, to have those different kinds of bigotry and such. At least that's what I think. What does everybody else think?
I agree with you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think it's in the air we breathe often.
Deb, what do you mean by that? It's in the air we
Well,
breathe.
I'm something I'm reading. Right, I'm reading Glennon Doyle right now, and she talks a lot about just the subtle shaping. I mean, not so subtle, but also very subtle shaping, particularly for people of privilege who may even be activists against racism, and yet often come face to face with someone calling them out on something they didn't perceive or understand, that our whole society is structured really toward misogyny and racism.
Sure.
So.
And let me back up just a little bit. I apologize for not doing this sooner. With all the powers invested in me as the Deputy Director of Tri-Faith, I'm officially making this a safe space.
Good.
So please, if you want to share a story or be a little vulnerable, I know it's a little hard, or if you have a question that you might not feel comfortable asking elsewhere, this is a safe space, and I hope everybody agrees to keep what happens in the Zoom room when we're talking and such. So there, I've set that safe space up. And Deb, I agree with you. There's definitely something, and maybe it's a culture thing, it's a history thing, it's something that just passes on innately sometimes. Does anybody have any other thoughts? How does society teach us to have a prejudice or a bias?
Hey there, this is Heather Engdahl.
Hey, Heather.
Hey, a thought that I'm having, I just kind of wanted to share, just thinking about like white supremacy and how that continues to exist in sometimes less obvious ways, but always systemic and there. And I think that I've seen a lot of different ways when people benefit from that, whether they know it or not. And I think that often transcends in different ways to then it's taught and learned to kind of reinforce that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And actually, I'm going to read a very quick quote or definition of racism. And again, we're using racism as just one of the examples of the many types of bigotry out there. So racism, as well as all other isms, is prejudice coupled with power. Does anybody have a reaction to that definition? Prejudice coupled with power.
I'm Becky Balestri. I'm a Presbyterian minister. And my experience has been that when a female pastor does something wrong, the congregation vows never again to have a female pastor. So there's something in being able to see and identify some traits that contributes to the bigotry. If a male pastor makes a mistake, it is not globalized to all male ministers. So there's something attached to a bad experience with somebody of either a race or a gender, and then it becomes globalized for reasons I don't quite understand.
So, and that would be considered sexism, is that correct?
Oh, yes, right.
Okay, so
and the congregation has power over the pastor.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me back up just a little bit. You know what? We're talking about racism. That's one form of bigotry. We just mentioned sexism. What other isms out there?
This is Sandy. Can you hear me?
Hey, Sandy. Yes, we can.
I just had a quick comment. I think we are not born isms. We don't have an ism, we're born. It is in, however, as soon as we are into some particular, whatever the ism is. And generally the isms are more, I think more clear to me, it's all about fear. And it's the fear component that drives whatever it is that becomes manifest in your being. And I think underneath all the bigotry, all the isms, all this stuff is, as we've talked about so many times, and I think what Deb was talking about, stuff's in the water, is trying to combat the fear. What is the fear? What are you fearful of?
So Sandy, let's dig into that a little bit more. And if anybody else has a thought, please jump in. What are we fearful of? Are we fearful of the other, of the unknown, of not having power, of having too little? What is it?
I think I just want to go back for one quick second.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you would have, I will put this out there.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly have the Jewish component of 5,000 years of persecution. And fear.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, people are fearful of dying, of being killed or harmed or hurt. I don't know if they're so much fearful of having stuff being, and there's many ways that it happens. Somebody's taking something away from me, and now I'll be quiet. Whatever the level of that is, whether it's my life or my livelihood or my family or my children or my beliefs or my, my space or my safe space, whatever it is, it really, fear powers.
Yeah.
All of it. Fear is
absolutely. Does anybody else have a thought on that? What are we fearful of?
Fear of the other culture or faith, that my one would be diluted or lost if they dominate. And that, I think, in North America and Europe is a big question right now. Absolutely. The fear of the other faith and culture.
Imam, why do you think we're fearful of the other culture, of the other person?
It's just that we feel threatened, that my faith and my norms in the society would be gone and replaced by the other. That's the only thing I can think of, because there is no other value to it that the fear should be there.
I could not agree with you more, Imam. I currently serve, I'm a veteran, so I've served in the military, and I've had friends that are more on the conservative side of things, and that is their fear. That is their fear, that one day they'll have to follow a specific law that is not theirs, or a specific doctrine, or a specific set of beliefs, and that is their core fear. So I agree, and I'm sharing that story just to provide a little triangulation to that.
And the fear is not just the fear outside; its fear is within the sectarian, struggle. It says, okay, that sect will do this. The history here in Canada was the fear of the Catholics among Protestant Canada. That was the fear in the beginning, and they were persecuted. They were more or less sidelined in many cases.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And going back and connecting that to what Deb and Sandy were saying, we have a lot to fear internally and externally. It's that thing in the air. That could be part of it. Where there are so many pressures, internal and external, that they manifest in a fear. And I think, and here's a provocative question, is the creation of an ism in a society, is it a human reaction? Is it a natural reaction to that fear?
I think most isms, the natural component is not the bigotry. It's actually the positive side of kind of creating community. And often what we end up doing by creating community is accidentally make the other by doing that.
Or we define ourselves by who we're not.
Right. And so when you create too great of a divide between your community and someone else's, I think that's where that comes from, and the structural educational components like to feed those extreme divisions.
Flesh that out a little bit for us, Jeremy. And Sandy, I see your hand, but before that, Jeremy, flesh that out a little bit more. You mean that there's a community that is trying to build a positive environment for themselves, and it's a side effect?
I think it's it's able to be capitalized on. It's not an, I don't really want to call it a natural peace. It's that when we do divide, even in positive ways, we have to be conscious of how that might affect how we view people outside of that community.
Sandy, did you have a word?
Yes, I think part of what begins to happen initially and immediately is that the minute we have a difference, we focus on keeping that difference in the foreground instead of acknowledging that we are different and looking for common ground. Now, that's a very broad, and I don't mean to make that, but it's really important in the context of overcoming the constant fear, because it's there. It's in the water, it's in the air, it's around us. We have to not only accept I think we have to accept that some of I have lots of isms that I work on, but if we can find the common ground, which is very, very difficult, like what the Imam was saying, when we are holding on to the fear that we will be lost in the crowd, Jews, interfaith marriage, all kinds of things that make it really, really difficult. Like Deb was saying, to maintain your identity. What's your identity based on? You don't have to give up some of those things. Some of those fears are good. Some of those places I don't want to release. I want to talk about being fearful, but I want to find a common ground. And I think that's what gets lost when we focus so much on the isms and not on the common ground.
And I see Heather in the comments is noting that us versus them mentality, and us, and there's also them mentality. And I'm finding this conversation already very interesting, because what is a healthy amount of fear? What's the healthy amount? And when does it turn to unhealthy fear? That is an open question. I don't know if I have the answer to that one.
I think that if I can say, society always feared the change. They're not ready to accept rock the boat, I would say. And in terms of people now, the big buzzword is diversity. With the global movement of population, people of different faiths, different cultures are now scattered all over the world. And the word said diversity is our strength, but how much of that strength is helping to allay the fear of the other? People say, yes, we accept diversity, we want laborers, we want workers here, but we have a kind of line, a firewall that you don't cross this side here. So the domination comes into play with that natural sort of instinct that no, it should be my way or the highway.
And it seems like it has been you called it a natural instinct, and that manifests in a pattern. I'll stick to just American history, where we have a pattern of Irish, and then first it was Chinese, then Irish, and then it was Latinos, now immigrants or Muslims. I don't think we're gonna solve institutional oppression and racism today, but I'm loving this conversation.
I think that we're seeing more, and you said we're in a safe place. I think that we're seeing more prejudice and bigotry against people coming into our country now. It just saddens me.
And I don't want to get too political, but you have to mention that there is a environment being created that allows that.
Yes, and I'm sorry to bring it up, but I think that this is something that there's always going to be some, like you say, it started out with the Irish and the Chinese and blah, blah, blah. But all of a sudden, I can't remember, and I'm 77, so I've seen a lot of decades. I can't remember ever seeing where there has been so much upset about people coming into our country.
Wow.
And I'm sad.
That's a big statement.
Well, sorry for people that don't agree with me, but
That's okay. That's okay. And Vicky, I see your comments in the chat. Vicky thinks there's not necessarily more bigotry. She thinks it's just more widely talked about. And I'll add to that, I think with digital media, it's easier to get that word out there and to see it.
And to magnify.
And to magnify, yes.
Well, and that is true.
Mm-hmm.
That is true. We're seeing more, you know, with 24-hour-a-day news and with you know, tweet and Facebook and all this. I agree with you, Deb. It's true. No, it is true. But it just still seems like there's just more of it.
Okay, and let's switch gears. How does bigotry manifest? And I'll kick things off by giving you a definition on scapegoating, which we touched upon just a bit. So scapegoating is the act or practice of assigning blame or failure to persons or groups instead of placing it directly on the cause or the persons on whom the blame actually belongs. What do people think of that definition? And I can repeat it if you need me to.
It's him.
That's well said, actually. People are looking to blame somebody. So that's why the scapegoating is always done. In whether it is
Well, and I think of what Anne was saying, I feel like scapegoating is at an all-time high, at least the overt, open, no shame in that scapegoating. And then I will be political. It is coming from the top down, and it just seems pervasive.
Yes, yes.
Hi, this is Heather. I would just definitely agree with that. And I think one thing I wanted to share too is, not to sound like a broken record, but going back to that power complex, and then also the conversation we just had about fear, and just thinking about how I think in a lot of ways that scapegoating is in some ways maybe to try to maintain that power or that image of, yeah, like that I keep saying superiority, but I really see that playing through in a lot of ways with these topics.
And Heather, you said that, and I was just getting ready to say again, because when I read something, then that's the only thing I think about for the next few hours. And I was just reading stuff from Together Rising, which is an activist group, trying to make a difference in the world. And they talk very much about first taking action at the individual level. So you see a child in a cage and you act on the border to try to connect that child with the parent, but you have to track it back to origin and work on a more systemic basis. And their contention seems to be, in our culture, it typically comes back to profit and to someone's interest on maintaining, as you said, Heather, power, but also what's mine is mine. And I care about what's yours.
And Deb, just to add to that definition, and that I see in the chat we have Tamara. She thinks it's easier for the dominant group, whoever that might be, who is feeling threatened, to do the scapegoating. And we have an addendum from Karen, and for a minority group to start scapegoating, to stop feeling like they're the ones being the victims of the dominant scapegoaters. It's like almost a cascade event. Do people agree with that? Like, I mean, I would love to discuss more even that second piece, because I think it's easier to accept that first piece, the dominant group doing the scapegoating, but that second piece is, I think, very interesting.
Hi, this is Tamara, if I can speak up for a second.
Please.
So I'm really enjoying this conversation. It's a very delicate one to have, and I appreciate everyone's perspective and input. What immediately came to my mind, because this is an incredibly complex subject, is I was raised overseas. I am a Latina, but I am a very white Latina, blonde. And overseas in my own Hispanic countries, as a kid, sometimes I was thrown like They threw stones at us and they said, Yankee, go home. Even if I'd say, hey, I'm one of you guys, you know, in Spanish. And then I come here, my sister's more the stereotypical Hispanic looking. And she was reprimanded for speaking Spanish to her children because they're in America and they need to be raised speaking English. So that's why it's, and I appreciate Karen's comment. It is very true also about that minority group feeling scapegoated. So I guess from having lived overseas and teaching international students for so many years, I love the diversity in my classrooms because I try to teach that it's probably, I don't know, it's hard, it's a difficult subject, right? To be more of an additive, to be diverse instead of a subtractive, because people are threatened, you know, identity, they are threatened by the other. And sometimes I think the more diversity you have within your own communities, I'm not gonna say easier, I'm not even sure what the right word is, because it's so complicated. It might be easier, the more, what can I say, facilitative it is to not necessarily have that much fear and to really learn from each other, that person to person. This is the tri-faith is so amazing, you know, because that being able to talk so openly with so many different people about faith, to me, is unbelievable. So I will stop talking because I can talk forever. But please, I'd love to comment. I'm a teacher.
And Tamara, thank you so much for jumping in and providing your identity, because you know I identify as a Latino male and here in South Omaha, and but my Spanish is not as good as I wish it would be. And it was because my parents wanted me to learn English, and that's the only thing you need to learn and learn it well. And when I try speaking Spanish, I mean, I can have a conversation with my mom, right, and my family, but out there, there's a little bit of anxiety when I do. Sandy, I saw that your hand was up. Please go ahead.
I'm gonna try to make this succinct and somewhat innocent. I think that here, one of the most delicate things that we are not able to talk about in this whole conversation about bigotry and politics and dogs and fights and differences is that as humans, we come with the need to self-preserve, to protect ourselves and to protect our families and to protect. So on a higher level, we've been talking about it, but on a deeper level, it also presents a real cognitive dissonance because I want to protect those I love. But in order to do that, I might have to do this thing over here that somebody really disagrees with. I mean, I lock my doors. You may not, I mean, I'm just going to keep this real simple, you know, but it's a real issue that I think one of the things that I notice I do is the minute something comes out that in some way affects my belief system or my need, my need to speak about it, I have a knee-jerk reaction. You can't do that, or why would you think that? Or what are you thinking? Or but if I go down underneath it, for example, I'm going to make this. I mean, it's a really simple. I think we can teach our children to protect themselves. We do it from bullies. We do it. We're starting to say in our culture, it is okay for you to feel very, very compassionate and loving towards and still have the ability to protect yourself in whatever form that comes in. So I don't know where that fits in the conversation, but I think when we have the reactions that we have without going that one step below, which is, I need to protect myself. That is my responsibility to protect me. Go ahead.
And that's, Sandy, I think you bring up a good point, that self-preservation, that safety and security, which is what one of those hierarchy of needs, one of the base ones, right? Now, let me play devil's advocate, because I like playing devil's advocate. In the Nebraska legislature this past session, we had a gentleman that he testified on one of the bills, and he said, I'm going to protect my family, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm going to protect my family, I'm going to protect my race, because that is a part of my identity. And that second part is me in parentheses, just to add context. Is that going too far? Is that reasonable?
I have some thoughts on this. In a video, I put my hand up, but it said the host is blocking video.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me.
Okay. No, that's all right. I logged on late. I think there's a fine line between, yes, we need to protect ourselves, and I'm all about that because I think boundaries are important. However, we have a president who is making divisiveness, racism, white supremacy fashionable. And sometimes we're protecting ourselves from something that doesn't exist, that we are creating in our mind because of our own prejudice. So it's a fine line because yes, we should protect ourselves, but we are being, with talk about denial and blame and scapegoating. I have never seen anything like it, what I see in our presidency right now. And it is dreamed up propaganda of, COVID is a conspiracy by the Democrats. And people seem to be drawn to conspiracy theories. So we have this trumped up fear of sometimes something that doesn't exist. And some of the people who are protecting their culture and they're afraid of immigrants coming in because we might change things and they'll be forced to, become like the newcomers. Some of them are working hard to force others to become what they are. Like, we need to make sure we the 10 Commandments in school or whatever other things.
Right.
And so both are true. It's true that we need to be able to protect ourselves and it's okay to do that. But when I hear people saying, I have pride in my race, it's like you don't have, the color of your skin isn't your ancestry. Anyway, so I'm just babbling on too long, but that's kind of my thought, that you can protect yourself, but you also have to ask yourself now in this day, racism is so rampant and almost fashionable in some cultures that it's a drummed up fear.
And Gail, just to jump in really quick, a quick little in Wendy's research for this topic, race as a concept is not scientific and has been disavowed by the American Anthropological Society. And I found that so interesting. I didn't know that. I'll be honest. I did not know that. So it's something that we made up. And I think our human brains are wired to generalize things, to assign value to things, to make it easier for us to categorize and to understand and such. So I think we have definitely hit the scapegoating piece really hard. And let's continue to switch gears.
May I add something
yes,
along
Susan,
that?
please, go ahead.
A personal experience. So I was taking my granddaughter, she was 4 then, 3 or 4, to Do Space because they have a kids class.
Great spot if you have not been.
And the teacher that was, the woman who had been teaching the class was a white female, 30-ish, 35, something like that. And she resigned, and the man who started teaching it was African-American in his 20s with dreads halfway down his back. And all of a sudden my granddaughter didn't want to go to class anymore. I mean, she knew which days of the week were because she knew which day she was going to Little Labs. That's how much she loved it. And I couldn't figure out why she stopped wanting to go. And I couldn't believe this was going to be possible because this isn't the way we live our life. And I said, did you notice that Mr. So-and-so, that his skin is different than ours? And her eyes got as huge as saucers. And she said, yeah, Grandma. And she didn't know how to, even though we never talked about it, in her mind, she had already seen a difference and she didn't know how to make sense of it. And I was blown away. And so, I mean, I answered it. I said, well, it's because his family came from Africa and our family came from Europe because we'd been talking about the world map. After that, she went to class. She didn't have any problems. But I was really surprised that at 4 years old, this was already a factor in how she was going to evaluate people.
Wow.
So my question is, or what comes up with this conversation and what you just said about Whitney, how much is this what we learned as children, even if it's very subtle or even if it's by observation and we don't know how to make sense and we make it up ourselves?
I know in the education realm that we're learning and knowing more and more how formative those early years, 0 to 3, 0 to 4, are to the overall formation of a person, their social and emotional norms and foundations. So actually, that doesn't surprise me.
Do you mind if I add one last
Please
little
do,
thing?
Jeremy. Yeah.
Okay. So I just want to add also that that scapegoat is a term that comes from religion also. It's the goat that we put our sins on the goat and sacrifice the goat. That's where it comes from. So, when we think about the history of religion and bigotry to some extent, it's important to remember that there is still a connection there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I want to shout out to Vicky. I think, Vicky, you just nailed this on the head. And if you have audio, please jump on in. I'll go ahead and read off in the chat. Vicky, a white woman from Connecticut, just to give context. I think there's a difference between people of color claiming pride in their race, a socialized concept as mentioned, and white people. The power differential is huge. Claiming pride in one's marginalized identities is a reclaiming of one's humanity. White people claiming pride in their race suggests that we are being oppressed. And I see that there's a lot of affirmation and that's okay, Vic. And please, anybody, Vicky doesn't have audio, that's okay. But I think hit the nail on the head. What are everybody's thoughts on this? And you can read it in the chat too if you need to reread it.
It's one thing to be proud of German heritage and things that came out of Germany, say a food or a style of clothing, but it's entirely different to say proud of being white, because white is so varied and it's just the skin color. And like Vicky mentioned, it is in our culture the dominant skin tone, and there's power differential.
Yeah.
I do always find it really interesting that I think a lot of white Americans cling a lot to heritage, whether it's I'm German or I'm Irish, and I think work a lot to maintain and be proud of those traditions. And so it's really interesting for me to see the way they treat people from other countries that are not white, and that kind of demand to assimilate, right? To let go of your traditions or your language or your food or whatever. But at the same time, a lot of those same people are very proud of their own, right, roots and traditions. And so that kind of hypocrisy, speaking to what you talked about earlier, Eric, it just kind of always drove me nuts.
Yep, absolutely. Yes. Let me kick it over to Jeremy for just a little bit, because in the last 20 minutes, the time is flying by the way, in this conversation. Jeremy, your master thesis, when you talked a little bit about how white supremacy takes root at the individual level. Can you give us just a 1-2 minute walkthrough? How does it take root?
Yeah, so, I mean, basically, now there's a lot of factors, obviously. Right. There's the structural component, there's the psychological component, there's a lot of pieces to this, there's education involved. But when I did my master's thesis, I studied a variety of people. I had interviews with people who considered themselves former white supremacists. And I really wanted to understand, how did people modify how they viewed the world to move away from white supremacy. They weren't great social justice advocates or anything like that anymore, but they definitely were not a danger to society anymore. And that's a low bar, but it's an important bar to reach. And I mean, I would break it up into 3 main things, and the psychological component specifically is what I'm talking about. And that is, number one, a lack of well-being or a perceived lack of well-being. Okay, and this has to do with, you know, the economic, this has to do with the social, a lot of different pieces. If you haven't read our articles that we put out about trifaith during coronavirus, some of what I talk about during this will be actually a little bit of overlap.
Very good blogs. Please check them out. Find them on our website.
So, you know, promoting human well-being does do quite a bit. You know, if people are not severely lacking, that is a basic thing that everyone needs. The second is a lack of meaning. And often this has a little bit of overlap. As we probably all know, white supremacy as, you know, an individual ideology is often held by particularly young men. Obviously there is some diversity in there, but it's mostly young white men. And often as far as I have seen, there's a struggle of economic, and there's also a struggle of meaning, in particular due to employment levels or satisfying jobs, to be honest. And then the third is this piece of alienation. And there's a lot of components that go into alienation, but the big piece is like, if they cannot find any community that will have some level of patience with them, then they find the community that does. And at a certain point, there's only one community left that will accept their stuff, and then they go kind of deeper down that hole. The white supremacist community pretty much just requires you to be white and loud, and so you can be part of that, you know. And then there's this fourth piece that I think is kind of like the wild card factor. You know, not all white supremacist violence can be boiled down to individual struggle, although I do think it's a very powerful factor. There's always this piece of, while I don't believe that people are naturally inclined toward white supremacy, there are people who are a little more naturally inclined to violence, or, you know, just having a little more fight or flight response in general.
Right.
And that in particular is also a contributing factor to how people often attach themselves to white supremacist ideologies.
And thank you for going through that. I think the very, very somber, I think almost sad lesson there is that people turn to extreme ideologies in their quest to just have value, have an identity, be part of a community. So they just want to be human. They just want to belong. And that's such a sad realization for me that I've had. However, let's go into the last segment, and that's combating bigotry. Yeah.
I wanted to ask Jeremy a question.
Oh, please do. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think this will probably fit into what you're just saying that we need to talk about now. Was there one underlying thing that most of them had that got out of there?
Great question.
Or is that too complicated? Is that going to take 2 hours to? Yeah.
I would say that, and I'm just going to be direct about it. They had white friends and family that had the privilege of not being in danger and being around them, have enough confidence to both call them out and have patience for the process that it takes for someone to move out of that ideology. So there's this very difficult line between that patience and that direct confrontation that is very hard to balance, but it is possible. And their families were really the only ones that would accept them to the point to get them through that.
Okay.
Yeah. Does that help?
Yes.
It's almost like they needed a human connection, a human intermediary to get them there. So again, I don't think in the next 16 minutes, we're not going to solve institutional racism and all of its forms. But what we can do is talk a little bit about combating bigotry. And I want to zoom in specifically on how can we combat everyday bigotry. And I think this is very important. So just to give you some examples, like you hear somebody use the N-word in conversation, or somebody tells a racist joke, or stereotyping at work, or maybe even a teacher teaching like an ideology based on intolerance, or you see a parent at the supermarket maybe teaching what you would consider wrong values. Let me start with what other examples of everyday bigotry have you seen or have you experienced? That's open to anybody.
Well,
I have.
Sorry.
No, go ahead, Aman. You go ahead.
Yes.
Imam, go ahead, please.
Okay. I can say about in workplaces, here in Canada, we have many immigrants who are racial minorities. And in a dominant workplace with what I would call the Caucasian people or white people, that if a mistake is made by any racial minority person, it is magnified many times.
Mm-hmm.
If they do something really good for the benefit of the employer or so, it is hardly mentioned. And this is, unless there's some places the HR has taken action on these things here when it was brought to their attention. But generally that is the norm, that says, okay, if I make a mistake, I'll be fired, or I will be sort of some kind of punished, or get a demerit or so easily. And this is what stops promotion and advancement of many minorities in employment. That's my personal experience until I retired.
Imam, thank you so much for sharing that personal experience. That is a perfect example of everyday bigotry that is in a lot of ways institutionalized, innate sometimes to the culture, unfortunately. Any other examples that we see out there?
This is Krista.
Hi, Krista.
I'll do my video so people can see me. Interestingly enough, my company had an hour talk yesterday about almost the exact same thing. They talked about microaggressions, which is a form of bigotry where people make little jabs at you on, on your race, your size, your, whatever. So that I just found that kind of interesting with that.
Right. Absolutely. Those microaggressions. That is very real. I know I'll share my story. Earlier in my community work, I was told that I should not run for a specific office because if I were to lose, I would show the community that a Latino can't win that office. Therefore, they'll never give another Latino or Latina a shot. And that blew my mind. But then, and that was earlier in my community career, I'm learning that that's actually kind of true. Similar to if I see a Latina run for an office at the high level, and I've seen it actually on the East Coast and the West Coast, you'll see it, and they lose, people would say, see, that's proof that they, quote unquote, can't win. I've seen it.
Yeah. But on the other hand, have you noticed, and lately I think we're seeing so many mayors of cities coming on to CNN or other, whatever you watch, how many women are mayors of cities now and how many women of color are mayors of cities? It's phenomenal.
That's a good point. We're definitely
absolutely
progressing.
Phenomenal.
We're certainly progressing in that respect.
Yeah.
If I might share a story.
Please do, Becky.
My daughter was born in Korea. Her boyfriend is biracial. He's got kinky blondish hair, but anyhow, they are clearly minority people. There was an incident in their neighborhood where people said there were BB guns being shot at their house.
Mm-hmm.
There are a number of people in the neighborhood with BB guns. My daughter called me in a panic. The police are here, Mom, and we're having trouble. So when I arrived, a police officer was arguing with my daughter on the front step. And as soon as I walked up, his whole demeanor changed. And my daughter could see him change in front of her.
Wow.
And later when we talked, she felt very discriminated against, and her impression was that these officers took an immediate opinion of her and her boyfriend because of their races. As I drove away from their house after everything settled down, there was a little white boy 3 houses down holding up a gun, a BB gun, and playing. And the police officers apparently did not stop and talk with him about it. My daughter and her boyfriend experience have daily experiences like that of seeing me, the predominant white person and older, treated differently than they are treated. And I don't have much response for them.
Wow. Becky, thank you so much for sharing that. And so now, how do we combat that? How do we push back against these everyday examples of bigotry? And it's something, and I'll preface it with, it's something that is so much easier to say. We all know it's right, but it's much harder to do. At least that's been my experience.
I've said it. My husband and I, for 30 years, owned a woodworking supply store, Midwest Woodworkers. And one time we had a gentleman that was working for us part-time. We had known him for years. He was retired Air Force, and then he was an excellent woodworker. And he had sold a saw blade to somebody. It didn't work out for that somebody. And the guy came in and said to me, and he used the N-word, guy sold that to me. And I said, you will not use that word in my store. You will not use that word against my friend. Now, here I was a businesswoman. I'd owned this thing, and I thought, well, do I lose a customer or what? But I couldn't stand it. And we had a couple of little incidences over the 30 years. When we first went into business, it was in '79. And as most of you know, most of the power tools are made in China and Japan. And we'd get rants about, I fought in World War II against the Japanese. Every once in a while, some guy would go on a rant. That just happened for a couple of years. And they got over it, realizing if they want a power tool, they're going to have to buy one made in Japan. But, and we'd say, I wouldn't say anything. I wouldn't give them a lecture. But if we had, like I say, we had 3 different incidences. Now I won't tell you the other ones. Well, I will, because it's funny. A guy said, now that Obama's president, they're changing the rose garden into a watermelon patch. So I went to the door with him, and I have Latino granddaughters. One of them's very dark. I said, you don't know this about me. And this was a guy that had been coming for years. I said, I have a granddaughter of color. One's very light, like the woman that just talked and said she was a blonde Mexican. My daughter-in-law is a blonde Mexican, so one of the girls is. But, and I didn't tell my husband about it for about a year because I thought he would probably kill me. But I did finally tell him about it.
Well, thank you for sharing and finally telling them about it.
And I just can't keep my mouth shut if somebody says something like that. I don't know what I would do if I saw a person and a child in a store and overheard them say something. I don't know if I'd have the courage to go up and say, that is horrible. But if somebody told me a horrible joke or said something like what I just explained to you, I would say it.
And that's a good two things. So Vicky, I see your story about putting up that they are thinking about putting up a Black Lives Matter sign in front of their church. They've been an open and affirming church for 25 years, but there's pushback to that because in an attempt to avoid the conversation about race, which is can be a difficult subject to talk about. So thank you for sharing that. And I'm gonna do a quick pitch. I forget the specific date, but I believe it's the first week of June. Sierra, please back me up. I'm actually going to be hosting an open conversation like this on how to be a good ally. So that would be Vicky.
Sorry, Thursday, June 4th, yes.
Thursday, June 4th. So Vicky, that would be a great, bring that back on Thursday, June 4th. And we can talk about that. Sandy, I see your hand up. Let me go into, I think the simplest thing that we can do to combat bigotry, especially that everyday bigotry, and it's a catch-22 almost, is tell people when you see it, that's not right. The issue with that, however, is how much impact does it have unless you back it up with, here's why. And I think that's something that it's not as easy. Sandy, please go ahead.
I just wanted to end in a little bit on, very quickly, 50 years ago when I was in undergraduate school, many years ago, I actually was dating an African-American, and we had this big conversation about how I was going to just go in and be the social worker and go into the ghetto communities, as they were called, this little communities, and help out. And he said, no, you go into your community, I'll go into mine, and we'll build a bridge. And that's the way, I think that's the way it's gone forward. That's what Tri-Faith does, as we all do. We just have to work we have to build bridges and come to the middle. But I think what you were saying, Anne, a minute ago is, it really does start within the very small piece of what you say. And the whole thing about teasing is not a good thing. Teasing, the brain doesn't understand teasing very well unless you're really specific. So when you say something to somebody, or you hear something, but more importantly, what we do, what we model. I think what we model is important. And if I've said something, or somebody said something to me, I also have to be able to say, that's not right. Don't say that to me. Or it's as much, I think it's the bridge. We build that bridge.
Absolutely.
We build that bridge.
And please, everybody keep building that bridge. Does anybody have any last parting thoughts here in the last couple of minutes? Please, Imam, yes.
I want to say one thing that I always say this, how to combat racism. So let's start seeing from a human lens. See people, person as a human being first before we label them with any race or religion or any other ethnicity or so on. So as long as we see people as a human being, that's what. Now, I give my own personal example. When I was appointed Human Rights Commissioner in Ontario here, I was asked, at that time, sexual communication was put in the code. So I was asked that question, how I'm going to deal with. I said, well, religion on one side, but I have to see every Ontarians, everyone as a human being, if their rights are protected. So as long as we can start seeing people from the human lens, that's what a way to combat racism or bigotry.
Imam, that's a great point. Seeing everybody, that shared humanity.
Yeah.
It's so important. Thank you so much for sharing. I will close things out. Thank you all so much for the conversation. Becky, I see your chat. I did just share a link. We are on May 20th. We are having a best practices to mitigate risk when delivering faith-based services. It's a tri-faith initiative. We are partnering with Dr. Adi Apor, who is the chair of the Douglas County Health Department, and the mayor of Omaha. We're going to be talking about how faith-based organizations can mitigate risk when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. And when you're gathering and such, we would love to see, it is a Zoom call. Please register. We would love to see a lot of lay leaders and clergy members be part of that call. please sign up. It's right there in the link description. Also, we have a second link for the Survey Monkey. If you enjoyed this conversation, please, please, please go ahead and fill out that survey. It really does help out a lot. It is on the 20th. So it is here this upcoming Wednesday at 3:30 Central Time. Please sign up. We'll also, I'm sure we'll be sending out emails. If you're on our mailing list, we'll be sending those out as well. Thank you all again for attending, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.